So weddings are usually fancy, they're beautiful, they're elaborate, they're complicated, they're sentimental, they're touching, they're expensive. With all the working parts and all the fixins, it's easy to lose sight of what's most important. Surely, and I've realized this after all these decades, it's not the preacher, it's not the soloist, even though Tim Graff is a great choice. The photographer, you might think it's that because it's so expensive and it takes 9 hours to take pictures. But here's the thing, you think you're going to go back to your wedding album over and over and over again, but after a while it becomes simply a go-to when family or friends stay at your house too long, and they become like fish. They just should go. And then you look at them, and here's a trick. If they stay too long at your house, you say, hey, do you want to go through our wedding album? And then all of a sudden, they want to go back home. The florist, they're lovely. But what do you do with all those flowers? And I think most flowers are about the equivalent of my first 2 vehicles. So I don't know if that's most important. Well, I'll get to the point. Nothing is more important at a Christian wedding than Jesus. The couple thought I was going to say the couple, but it's not. We begin, at least if you have one of us 5 pastors, we say this at the beginning of a wedding ceremony: as you gladden the wedding at Cana in Galilee by the presence of your son, so by his presence now bring your joy to this wedding. So you just kind of hopped into a wedding liturgy in this text. In other words, at a wedding, if you're going to have a Christian wedding, we're glad that Jesus is here. We wouldn't do this without your blessing. In fact, we think you brought us together, and we will take you with us. As the Episcopal Church put on billboards many years ago, they have a better marketing department than the ELCA. They had all these billboards, and one of them was, love the wedding. Now invite me into your marriage. Sincerely, Jesus. Brilliant. Well, it just so happens that today's text is about a wedding. One day Mary went to the mailbox and she discovered that she'd been invited to a wedding and she likes him. She said, awesome, when is it? Oh, the 7th of June, great, I'm free. Turns out Jesus received his own invitation, Jesus plus 12, which sounds audacious, but he had to bring his disciples. Now, here's what we know about weddings in that day. They lasted for days and days. You think weddings are long now? No, they went on for days. In fact, after they got married, they went to their house and they had to wait in that house for 1 week for all the family and friends to come and look at their wedding album and eat their stuff and drink their wine. So everyone had their role: the clergy, soloist, photographer, cake, check. Someone was in charge of the grill and the chips and the dip and the salad. But nothing was more important, apparently, than wine. And somebody who was in charge of that failed miserably. Now, they might have run out of pickles and maybe condiments, but apparently running out of wine is a big deal. Because this is how the text begins. On the 3rd day, there was a wedding, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, that's where it went. The mother of Jesus turned to her son and said to him, they have no wine. Okay, so here's what goes through my mind. No mention of the couple. Can you imagine being them? Nothing about their wedding party, nothing about the dresses. Did they look good? The flowers, the photographer, soloist, officiant, all that really seems to matter is we ran out of wine and Total Wine is now closed. But what I find interesting is when you deal with the Bible, as long as I've dealt with the Bible or your clergy, you want to find something, you want to read it, and you want to see it afresh. And what I find very interesting, as soon as almost a lightning bolt, Mary gave Jesus, her son, the mom look. Right? All you moms have the look, right? You kind of just laser in and you just have that glare, and said through clenched teeth, are you going to fix this or what? We have a problem. Now, 2 things. First of all, I think a lot of scholars, at least that I read, think that probably Mary had something to do with watching the wine. You are to watch the wine, and when we run out, you send Tom, Dick, or Harry over to Total Wine. But number 2, who needs Tom, Dick, or Harry when Mary knows that her son is Jesus? He was at creation when he hung the stars. So surely he can make more Merlot. Now hop to it. But apparently Jesus was not feeling it because he looks at his mom and he says, and I quote, "Woman." Yeah, try that if you're a kid. Not mom, but woman. What concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come. Okay, 3 things. The mind is a terrible thing. 1, that has to be about as close as one can get to not honoring your mama as you can be without not honoring your mama. Number 2, if Mary was the monitor of the wine supply, clearly Jesus had no idea, which explains and gets him off the hook when he says, "What concern is that to you?" But Mary would have said, "Don't you remember? I signed up on Sign Up Genius. I'm in charge of the wine from 2 to 7. Remember?" And number 3, Mom, yes, son. We have been doing everything we can for years and years to make sure that no one knows my true identity. It's like a superhero. And once I do a miracle, it's all over. It will spread like wildfire. So regardless of what was said or not said, Mary looks at the member of the waitstaff and she says, I think she'd been to Minnesota because she was passive aggressive. Because they had this little back and forth, and she just looks at the steward and says, do whatever he tells you to do, which was her way of saying, as long as you live in our basement, Jesus, do what I say. Because she did win that little rhetoric moment. Now, I'd love to know more about the interaction, and I'm not making this up. It's there, and so obviously it's important. Did Jesus put a smile on his face and just all of a sudden go, okay, Mom? Or did he do like most of our kids when you tell them to clean their room? I don't want to do this. Can't you just see Jesus saying, okay, fine. Doesn't matter. This much we know for sure. Jesus said, go over to that one, not that one, that one, and go over to that spigot. And they had more wine than a bunch of weddings could consume. But also, Jesus is a really good winemaker, because as soon as they noticed this, they went up to the bridegroom and said, well, you guys are amazing, because most people will serve the good wine, and then when people become unable to discern good wine, they bring out $2 chuck. But not you. You serve the good stuff at the end. And then today's text ends with these words, Jesus did this, the first of his signs, and he revealed his glory. See what I'm talking about? And then it reads, and his disciples believed in him. Not even his disciples really believed in him until this happened. And so all of a sudden it got real. All of this, of course, gave rise to a few more thoughts, 3 to be exact. Number 1, please employ my clicker. There you go. Point number 1, any story told by Jesus is always about Jesus. You might think that this is saying that Jesus is self-absorbed, but it's not. You know, you've been with people, and you will say, well, this happened to me, and they'll say, that reminds me of a story about me, which is more interesting than you. But Jesus is not self-absorbed, but especially when he told parables, it's not about we have to be a certain way, it's about we are a certain way. And most of all, it's Jesus telling us about himself. I do have examples, the parable of the lost sheep. Now, I tell these stories because not everyone knows these stories. So a bunch of holy people are standing around and they're being judgmental because tax collectors and sinners are coming to Jesus, which is kind of like a sick person going to a doctor. But they're judgmental, and they wonder, why would Jesus talk to these terrible people? So Jesus knows this, he senses this, and instead of Jesus just kind of going, you're just wrong, he says, I have a story to tell you about me. So there's a shepherd, has 100 sheep, and one of the little rascals gets away. And because this shepherd cares about all the sheep, this shepherd decides to go after the one little rascal that got away and leaves the 99 back there. Now, they're probably thinking that if you're going to hire a shepherd, don't hire that person. Because really, Can you imagine if your investment broker did that? Can you imagine if that's how your stockbroker? No, you keep the 99 and keep them safe, and you're going to have collateral damage, but not in the economy of God. Because when you come back to the 99, the wolves and the hyenas are going to go, we think you're a great shepherd, because they will have their fill. But Jesus is simply saying, if one of you goes astray, I'm going to forsake the 99 and go get you, which is good because it might be your daughter, it might be your son, it might be your husband, it might be a friend who's one of those, or it might be you. Every story told by Jesus is about Jesus. The parable of the prodigal son. I will tell this as long as I'm employed, and I'll tell it in case you don't know all of it. Jesus is saying, this is how I run the world in which I live. There's a father and two sons, and the youngest of two sons comes up and says, I would like my inheritance. Now, two things. Number one, that's really rude when dad is still alive and playing pickleball. But number two, according to the law of that day, the young got butkus. Everything went to the oldest. So this is the first time where you see the oldest saying, well, fill in the blank. You're greedy, and I don't like you. And he's like this. And he's waiting for the father to say, but the father says, here's my debit card. The oldest kid is ticked. And then the youngest son goes to Vegas, but probably now Nashville, because they party better than anyone. And he runs up all these things. He's out of money. He's drinking wine. He's partying, but then he wakes up and he has no place. He looks at a pig and says, well, this is my home. I'm going to go home. I'm going to grovel. I'm going to say, you know what? I'll live as a servant. He's practicing his speech. And he's going down the driveway, and there's the dad. And the dad sees him, and the dad is just elated, and he runs, and he kisses him, and he holds him up in the air, and then the older brother comes, and he's still ticked. You're going to get grounded. No video games for you, ever. And the father says, go get the fatted calf. What? You gave him your debit card. Now we're going to have, not Beatrice. Yeah, we thought he was dead. He's home. Let's rejoice. Let's do something else. Father says, do you do the right thing so I reward you, or just do the right thing? Everything I have is yours. Don't get petty that I'm showing mercy to your brother. And actually, I'm showing mercy to you, because a good thing you don't get what you deserve, because your heart is cold. You follow? The parables of the workers in the vineyards. So there's a woman who owns a vineyard, needs some people to do some stuff. So goes into town and says, hey, you want to work for me? Show up at 9, end at 5, we'll pay you $50. Just act impressed. Yeah, that's great. Okay, right. Well, you work, but we need more hands. And so goes into town, and she says, hey, will you come at noon and work and end at 5? I'll pay you $50. Well, not bad. I'll show up at noon. The two of you, are great, but then you need one more, and they come up and say, well, you know what, you come at 3, and you can quit at 5, and I'll pay you $50. Yeah. So at the end of the day, at 5 o'clock, the whistle blows, and all these 3 people come up, and this is before ADP, so there was nothing in your check. They have to just hand you money. And you all know, is you showed up at 9, you showed up at noon, and you showed up at 3, and you all get the same pay. And the first 2 says, well, I don't like this place. And one of them says, I love this place. How about tomorrow? That's how Jesus loves. It's a good thing, because sometimes, metaphorically, we show up at 3 and love our neighbor for 2 hours and actually expect that we get treated the same as the people who do it from 9 to 5. Today's text, there's a wedding, there's a party, love is in the air, wine runs out, but it's really about Jesus and his amazing love. Point number 2, grace is free and totally undeserved. So I'm going to bring up a poem in my sermon. I did laud myself first service that I am bringing up a poem. I am going to become highbrow. I am the least of all of our pastors to quote someone who wrote a poem, but it's not Longfellow. It's not anyone who's highbrow. It's John Mooney. But I am referencing a poem. So mark that off your list. A Renaissance guy, for sure. But years ago, my previous call, someone sent me this Christmas from Heaven poem and knew I'd like it because my mother had died. And really what it is you read it and then you realize your loved one is in heaven. And then I read these words, I still hear, I still feel, I still share. I just want to tell you, you still make me proud. And of course, if you know me, I was bawling like a baby because I was thinking of my dear mom, that she's in heaven. And everyone should read this poem. And then I read the rest of the poem. And actually reading the rest of the poem is analogous to almost every second half of every Minnesota Vikings game when they're in any kind of divisional playoff ever. They disappoint you. And so did John. And I'm not mocking, but it's a free country, and I can teach you what we see as Lutherans. Because I read on, and then I read, keep trying each moment to stay in his grace. You don't have to be perfect all of the time. He forgives you the slip if you continue the climb. All right, okay. Welcome to Lutheran Moment 102. This is not 101 because I just skipped by 101. Keep trying each moment to stay in his grace, he wrote, and then I tell you, do not put trying and grace in the same sentence. Make sense? Grace. I got to try to get your grace. No. Grace exists because you're not trying. Because you can't leap tall enough to dunk the ball, metaphorically. You and I don't love our neighbors as we should. Every single Sunday, have you noticed a trend, is that we simply say, we haven't done your will, but please forgive us. But I just have to try harder. Well, how old are you? Haven't you tried enough by now? Don't put those two together. Grace is a gift. Grace is not earned. It cannot be achieved. It is without merit. It cannot be obtained. Grace is getting the first place trophy when you don't come in first. And I'm not saying that I'm competitive. Everyone knows I said first service, if someone wants to race me to the restroom, I will trip you on the way. I will try to win. I will break something. Don't hand out medals to everyone. Our son, who is an accomplished swimmer, he's going to swim in college, but he got an 8th place medal. Stop at 3. Save the medal. But we're not talking about lacrosse. We're not talking about swimming. We're not talking about the way that we do things. But we do things because we're limited. We want to feel good, and we want to step on somebody else to feel good. But Jesus says, I love all of you. And if you work at 9, or you work at noon, or you work at 3, you get the same. And if you say, then I want to show up late, then I guess you have a soul problem. It's not God's problem. It's what's in your heart. You don't have to be perfect all the time. He forgives you the slip if you continue the climb. Welcome to Lutheran Moment 103. He forgives you the slip if you continue the climb. Do not ever use forgive and if in the same sentence. Parents, do you happen to know that your kids, when they sin, and it's, by the way, it's not slip. You slip when you fall in the ice. It's called sin. But you realize that your kids, even if they're 20, 22, 25 years old, they have not told you all the things they've done wrong. And you know that when they have kids of their own and then they start getting the slip from their own parents, you're going to open up a bottle of wine and then your daughter or son will look at you and say, well, you know, the 7 times I said I was going over to Jamie's house? Yeah, we went to a party and we were drinking. And you say, I knew. If we make forgiveness conditional upon us apologizing, then we've actually forgiven or not forgiven ourselves. Make sense? We don't make baptism necessary to go to heaven. Because if we do, that means that if I were to only have lived a couple days and I wasn't baptized, if I'm not saved, it's on my parents. Everything is a means of grace in the Lutheran Church. And climbing the ladder, welcome to Lutheran Moment 104, we cannot ever climb our way to God, which is why God decided to come down to us in Jesus. Martin Luther, of all the 95 reasons, one of the biggest things for him is we don't keep track, because if you keep track, then you keep track most of all of your neighbor. If you are in a wilderness area and there's a bear, you just have to be a little bit faster than the person you're with. And we keep track, don't we? We keep track of 9, noon, and 3. Jesus says, don't keep track. How about if I just save you? Point number 3, we're almost done. How and where does Jesus make more wine for you in your life? Because you know this isn't about the literal wine, right? Because you know that somebody did drink that wine. And then when they ran out at another wedding, if Jesus wasn't there and Total Wine was closed, you had to drink Fresca. Because it just doesn't happen if Jesus isn't there. And so I think it's a metaphor. I think we have to think of analogies. We have to think about, and I'm going to give you some homework, because Gracia Grindal, one of my favorite professors at Luther Seminary, and 2 people during the break said that they had her, one at Luther College and another knows her as a friend, and she's now 80. Hi, Gracia, if you ever listen to this. She was a professor of rhetoric, and I love that because I love rhetoric. I love debate. I love words. I love how the sentences go and therein. But one time, she was teaching preachers how to preach. It wasn't a preaching class, but how to use words. And she said, in all your sermons, you don't have to answer all people's questions. Sometimes you give them work to think for themselves. And it's not like I didn't have enough time. I could make this up like that. But why would I tell you all the answers to how does Jesus make more wine in your life? If I have to go up to you and say, you know, you have a great spouse, and let me tell you all the reasons, if you don't know that, I can't convince you. When people come up to you and say you have great kids, they're not making them great kids by saying they're great kids. They just have realized they're great kids. When you're a hard worker at work, you don't go up and say, by the way, I'm a hard worker. Do you know when people come up and say, I'm a hard worker, you know one thing that's true? They're probably not. People say that about other people. But when it comes to what does my faith mean to me, this isn't something you just listen to somebody who is educated and then you say, this is mine. It's got to be yours. But I do think that a lot of us, myself included, kind of look at Jesus as similar to a highway helper. You see those men and women who drive in those pickup trucks? We have them in our state because we have high taxes. If you go across the United States of America, a lot of places don't have it because they don't pay what we pay. But I've seen people stop, and I'm thinking, what a great thing to have, right? If something happens, somebody drives up and says, can I help you change your tire? And what I'm saying is we look at them and say, well, I'm glad that you're stopped, so I don't have to. But also, I don't need that help right now. But my point is that we all need Jesus every single day. To be forgiven, to be cleansed, to get patience, to get forbearance, to get a portion of his love, to be loved like that, and then maybe love like that, to be forgiven like that, and then to be forgiving. It is simply, when I bury a spouse and I listen to someone who was well married, the real profound reason why they miss that person is that every single day we walk through life together. Yes. Oh, we had great anniversaries. Oh, he gave me great birthday presents. No. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Biggest fan. When my mom died, my dad said, when things were bad, I missed her because she was my soft place to land. When things were good, I missed her because I celebrated with her. How and where does Jesus make more wine for you in your life? The people I want to be like when I grow up, and I'm still growing up, and I still probably will never become mature, they will say, I'm blessed. There was a young woman, I think I said this before, she said blessed before it was blessed, and every day she was blessed, and she said it with a saccharine smile, and I found her to be really, really off-putting because no one could be that happy, although I think she still is. And when someone says, I'm blessed, that, by the way, is kind of a way now that we indicate to other people that we're believers without saying, by the way, I believe in Jesus, and do you? But when you say, I'm blessed, you're connoting that Jesus makes more wine in my life every single day. So how and where does Jesus make more wine for you in your life? Because you know what? They're going to run out of wine. Remember the story of Lazarus? I'll tell you in case you don't. One of Jesus' good friends, he dies. And they had sent him a text. And Jesus was busy doing Jesus stuff. And he says, well, I'll be there in a minute. I'll be there in a minute. I'm sorry, I'm kind of busy. But I actually think he drug his feet because he was going to illuminate something bigger. Because he died. And he came and they were like, oh, he wouldn't have died if you were here. And Jesus says, well, I'll look into it. Walks in and raises him from the dead. Remember that? I don't know if it was 2 years or 10 years later, but Lazarus, he did die again. He's not still alive. That's only Jesus. And that time, he stayed dead in an earthly sense. And then he rose, not because he was a good dude, not because he's a friend of Jesus, but because Jesus died on the cross for him. The point being, Jesus, every single day of our life, gives us abundant gifts. I'm asking you, and I've already asked myself because I've done my homework, how are you blessed? This is the end of our sermon series, but it's not the end of the party. And we hope that you've seen in these 4 weeks that Jesus, this super serious person who we think is against dancing, who's against this, is a whole lot of fun, and he loves abundantly and recklessly. And he says, no matter what you need, I'll give it. So the party doesn't end. Jesus made sure of that. We just wanted you to know that Jesus is a whole lot of fun, loves you completely, and there's nothing you can do to ever escape his love. Kind of like a party. A great moment that never ends. For that I say thanks be to God. Figure out how and where Jesus makes more wine for you in daily life. And perhaps life will seem more like a party. Woohoo. Yeah, I'm 100% Norwegian. For me, that was elation. Thanks be to God. Amen.